It was just another Tuesday afternoon in downtown Riverside. The clock on the old courthouse showed 3:47 p.m. when three motorcycles pulled up to the red light at Main Street and Federal Avenue. Nothing seemed unusual about this moment. People were walking home from work, kids were getting out of school, and the usual city noise filled the air. The first rider sat calmly on his black Honda, waiting for the light to change. His name was Jake Thompson, a quiet guy who worked hard and minded his own business. Behind him, two of his buddies rode their own bikes. They had been friends since high school and often rode together on weekends. Today was different, though. They weren't just out for fun. Jake reached up to adjust his helmet. The strap was digging into his chin, and he wanted to fix it before they continued riding. As he moved his hands up to his head, his bike wobbled slightly. It was nothing serious, just a normal movement that happens when you take one hand off the handlebars. Any experienced rider would understand this, but Officer Martinez saw something else entirely. Martinez had been a cop for 8 years. He was sitting in his patrol car about 50 feet away, sipping coffee and watching traffic. When he saw Jake's bike wobble, his training kicked in. To him, it looked like the rider might be under the influence of something. Maybe drugs, maybe alcohol. The wobble seemed suspicious. He grabbed his radio and called it in. "Dispatch, I've got 3 motorcycles at Main and Federal. Possible impaired driver. Requesting backup." The response came back quickly. "Copy that. Unit 47, backup en route." Jake had no idea what was happening. The light turned green and he started to move forward slowly. He was being extra careful because he knew motorcycles could be hard to see. He always followed traffic rules and never caused trouble. That's when the police sirens started. Martinez hit his lights and siren, pulling out behind the 3 motorcycles. The sound was loud and sudden. Jake looked in his mirror and saw the flashing red and blue lights. His heart started beating faster. He hadn't done anything wrong, but getting pulled over always made people nervous. He signaled and pulled over to the curb. His 2 friends followed behind him. They all turned off their engines and waited. This should have been simple. A quick check of licenses, maybe a brief conversation, and they'd be on their way, but Martinez was already calling for more backup. "I need additional units at Main and Federal. 3 subjects on motorcycles. Approach with caution." Within 2 minutes, 3 more patrol cars arrived on the scene. The afternoon traffic started to slow down as people rubber-necked to see what was happening. Pedestrians stopped on the sidewalk to watch. Some people even started recording with their phones. Jake slowly got off his bike, keeping his hands visible. He had been taught to always cooperate with police officers. He wasn't looking for any trouble. His friends did the same thing, moving slowly and carefully. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Martinez shouted, even though all 3 men were already doing exactly that. Jake spoke calmly. "Officer, is there a problem?" "We were just riding through town." Martinez approached with his hand resting on his service weapon. He was tense, treating this like a high-risk stop. "I observed erratic driving behavior. I need to see your license and registration." "Of course," Jake replied. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket to get his wallet. That's when Martinez noticed something that made him even more suspicious. Jake's jacket had several patches sewn onto it. Most people wouldn't think twice about motorcycle patches, but Martinez saw military-style insignia. There were numbers and symbols he didn't recognize. To him, these looked like they could be gang markings or something else dangerous. "Stop right there," Martinez commanded. "Don't move." Jake froze with his hand halfway to his pocket. He was confused. He hadn't done anything threatening. He was just trying to get his license like the officer had asked. 2 more officers arrived and quickly surrounded the 3 riders. The situation was escalating fast, and none of the motorcyclists understood why. "We're just trying to cooperate," Jake said, keeping his voice calm and respectful. "You asked for my license." "I was getting my license?" But Martinez was now convinced these men were dangerous. The patches, the way they rode in formation, their calm behavior under pressure, it all seemed suspicious to him. In his experience, innocent people usually got nervous when stopped by police. These guys were too calm. Turn around and put your hands on your bike, Martinez ordered. Jake was getting frustrated, but he still complied. This was taking much longer than it should. He had somewhere important to be, and this delay was going to cause problems. Big problems that the officer couldn't possibly understand. As Jake turned around, Martinez saw more patches on the back of his jacket. There were words and symbols that looked official, almost like military identification. But Martinez couldn't read them clearly, and in his mind, they could have been anything. The crowd on the sidewalk was getting larger. Someone had called the local news station. This was turning into a public spectacle, and Jake was starting to worry about more than just being late. "Officer, can you please tell me what this is about?" Jake asked one more time. "We haven't broken any laws." That question seemed to make Martinez even angrier. "You were driving erratically. I witnessed unsafe operation of a motor vehicle." Jake knew this wasn't true. He had been driving perfectly safely. The small wobble when he adjusted his helmet was completely normal. Any motorcycle rider would know that. But Martinez wasn't a rider, and he didn't understand. The backup officers were now searching Jake's friends, making them spread their legs and putting them down roughly. The crowd was getting restless, with some people shouting that the police were using too much force. Jake decided to try one more time to explain. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm actually—" "Stop talking," Martinez cut him off. "You have the right to remain silent." Jake's heart sank. They were being arrested. For what? For riding their motorcycles legally down a public street? For adjusting a helmet? This was insane, but something much worse was about to happen. Martinez had called for a supervisor, and Sergeant Rodriguez had just arrived on scene. She took one look at the situation and decided it needed to be brought under control quickly. There were too many people watching, too much potential for the situation to get out of hand. "Tase them," she ordered. Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Wait, what?" "We're cooperating. We're not resisting." But the decision had been made. Two officers pulled out their tasers and aimed them at Jake and his closest friend. The crowd started shouting, telling the police to stop. People were recording everything. "This is unnecessary," Jake said, his voice rising for the first time. "We're not doing anything wrong." The first taser hit Jake in the chest. 50,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. He dropped to the ground, his muscles contracting violently. He couldn't control his movements. The pain was incredible. His friend hit the ground next to him, also convulsing from the electric shock. The third rider was tackled to the ground. By two officers. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. This had gone too far. Three men who had been cooperating fully were now lying on the pavement, one of them still twitching from the electrical current. Jake lay on the hot asphalt, unable to move properly. His mind was racing. This couldn't be happening. He had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. And now he was face down on the street, handcuffed, while strangers recorded his humiliation. But Jake knew something the officers didn't, hidden in his jacket was a small device that had automatically activated when his body hit the ground. A device that was already sending out a signal that would bring help in exactly 7 minutes, help that would change everything. As Jake lay face down on the hot concrete, his cheek pressed against the rough pavement, something was happening that nobody at the scene could see or hear. Inside his leather jacket, sewn into a hidden pocket near his left shoulder, a small electronic device no bigger than a matchbox had come to life. The device looked innocent enough. Most people would think it was just another piece of motorcycle equipment, maybe a Bluetooth communicator or a GPS tracker. But this little black box was much more than that. It was military-grade technology, designed for one very specific purpose. When Jake hit the ground after being tased, the impact sensors inside the device triggered automatically. His elevated heart rate detected through microsensors in his jacket confirmed that he was in distress. The device immediately began transmitting a coded signal on a frequency that only certain people knew how to monitor. The signal traveled through the air, bouncing off cell towers and satellite relays, until it reached a concrete building 15 miles outside the city. The building looked ordinary from the outside, just another industrial facility surrounded by chain-link fencing. But inside, it was anything but ordinary. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Webb was reviewing paperwork in her office when the alert came through. She had been in the military for 18 years, working her way up through the ranks. Today had been quiet, just routine administrative work in preparation for an important mission scheduled for later that evening. The alarm that suddenly filled her office was not one she heard very often. It was sharp, urgent, and impossible to ignore. She looked up at the red light flashing on her communications panel and felt her stomach tighten. Code 7. Personnel in distress. Webb grabbed her secure phone and hit the speed dial for her operations. Center. The call was answered before the first ring finished. Operations, this is Colonel Webb. I have a Code 7 alert. What's the status? The voice on the other end was calm but urgent. Ma'am, we have an automatic distress beacon from Sergeant Thompson. Signal originated from downtown Riverside, Main Street area. Biometric sensors indicate he's been incapacitated. Webb felt a chill run down her spine. Thompson wasn't just any soldier. He was part of a very special team, and today was not a day for him to be having problems in downtown Riverside. When did the signal start? She asked, already reaching for her. Tactical gear? 4 minutes ago, ma'am. Standard protocol is automatic response within 7 minutes of initial alert. Webb was already moving. She grabbed her radio and started issuing orders as she headed for the door. This is Colonel Webb. I need Alpha Team geared up and ready to roll in 3 minutes. Full tactical response. This is not a drill. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers who had been relaxing, playing cards, or catching up on paperwork suddenly found themselves running for their equipment. They had trained for this scenario hundreds of times, but it had never happened for real back at the scene on Main Street. Jake was still handcuffed and lying on the ground. The officers had no idea that their routine traffic stop had just triggered a military emergency response. They were busy trying to control the crowd of angry onlookers and fill out paperwork. Officer Martinez was feeling confident about the arrest. He had 3 suspects in custody and backup had arrived to help manage the situation. In his mind, he had done good police work by stopping what looked like suspicious behavior, but Jake knew something that Martinez didn't. As he lay there, still feeling the aftereffects of the electrical shock, he was counting in his head. The device in his jacket had a built-in timer. When it activated, help would arrive in exactly 7 minutes. Not 6 minutes, not 8 minutes. 7 minutes. Jake had been part of military operations where timing was everything. 7 minutes was chosen very carefully. It was long enough to avoid false alarms from minor accidents, but short enough to respond to real emergencies before situations got out of control. Right now, with his face pressed against the pavement and news cameras starting to arrive, Jake really hoped the system would work exactly as designed. Meanwhile, at the military base, Colonel Webb was briefing her rapid response team. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were specially trained for situations exactly like this one. Each man and woman on the team had years of experience in sensitive operations. Listen up, Webb said as the team gathered around a large table, covered with maps and communication equipment. We have one of our people in distress in downtown Riverside. Sergeant Thompson's beacon activated 4 minutes ago. We don't know if this is an accident, an attack, or something else entirely. She pointed to a map of the city center. Thompson was part of today's advanced security sweep. He and his team were checking the route for tonight's convoy operation. If they've been compromised, we may have a serious security breach on our hands. The convoy operation Webb was referring to was classified, but everyone in the room knew it was important, very important. The kind of important that could affect national security if something went wrong. What's our response protocol, ma'am? Asked Sergeant Williams, the team leader. Full tactical response, we go in prepared for anything. If Thompson and his team have been captured or attacked, we need to secure them and assess any damage to operational security. Webb looked at her watch. 6 minutes had passed since the initial alert. Mount up, we leave in 60 seconds. The response team moved with practiced efficiency. They loaded into 3 armored vehicles, checked their communication equipment, and prepared for whatever they might find in downtown Riverside. As they drove toward the city, Webb tried to piece together what might have happened. Thompson was experienced and careful. He wouldn't trigger the emergency beacon unless something serious was wrong. But what could go wrong with a simple security sweep of city streets? Back on Main Street, the situation was getting more complicated by the minute. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and several people were recording everything with their phones. Local news crews were setting up cameras, and traffic was backing up as drivers slowed down to see what was happening. Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior officer on scene, was starting to feel overwhelmed. What had started as a simple traffic stop was turning into a public relations nightmare. She needed to get the situation under control quickly. Jake was still on the ground, but he was no longer unconscious from the taser. His head was clear, and he was thinking about what would happen when his backup arrived. He hoped the officers would listen to reason when they realized who they had actually arrested. The third member of their team, Tony Garcia, was sitting in the back of a police car, also handcuffed. He caught Jake's eye and gave an almost invisible nod. Tony was also counting down in his head. They both knew help was coming, but they also knew that when military vehicles showed up at a civilian police operation, things could get very complicated very quickly. The last thing anyone wanted was a confrontation between local police and military personnel in the middle of downtown Riverside. Jake closed his eyes and tried to stay calm. 7 minutes had seemed like a reasonable response time when they planned the system. But lying handcuffed on hot concrete while confused police officers tried to figure out what to do with him, 7 minutes felt like forever. He could hear the rumble of heavy engines in the distance, getting closer. The countdown was almost over, and everything was about to change. The rumble of diesel engines grew louder as Colonel Webb's convoy approached downtown Riverside. Inside the lead vehicle, Webb was on the radio with her operations center, trying to get a clearer picture of what they were driving into. Base? This is Alpha 1. We're 2 minutes out from the signal location. Any update on the situation? The radio crackled back. Alpha 1, local police scanners indicate they have 3 subjects in custody. No mention of injuries or hostile activity. Appears to be a routine arrest situation. Webb frowned. A routine arrest? That didn't make sense. Thompson wouldn't have triggered his emergency beacon for a simple traffic stop. Unless something had gone very wrong very quickly. Back at the scene, Sergeant Rodriguez was getting increasingly frustrated. The crowd wasn't dispersing, and she now had news cameras pointed at her officers. The last thing the department needed was bad publicity from what should have been a straightforward arrest. She walked over to where Jake was still lying on the ground. Officer Martinez had finally allowed the paramedics to check on him and his friend after the tasing, but both men were still in handcuffs. "What's your story?" Rodriguez asked Jake directly. "You guys gang members? Drug runners? What were you really doing riding through downtown in formation like that?" Jake looked up at her from the pavement. His face was scraped from being forced to the ground, and his shoulder ached from the awkward position of the handcuffs. But his voice was still calm and respectful. "Sergeant, we're not gang members. We're not drug runners. We're just 3 guys who were riding our motorcycles legally down a public street. Officer Martinez saw me adjust my helmet and decided that was suspicious behavior." Rodriguez studied his face carefully. In her 15 years as a police officer, she had developed a pretty good sense for when people were lying to her. This guy seemed genuinely confused about why he was under arrest. She looked more closely at his motorcycle jacket. The patches that had made Martinez so suspicious were clearer now that she was up close. Some of them had numbers and abbreviations that looked familiar, but she couldn't quite place them. "These patches on your jacket?" she said, pointing to them. "What do they mean?" Jake hesitated. He couldn't tell her the complete truth without revealing classified information. But maybe he could give her enough of a hint to make her start asking the right questions. "They're unit identifications," he said carefully. "From my previous job." "What kind of unit identifications?" Before Jake could answer, her radio crackled to life. All units, be advised we have reports of military vehicles approaching the downtown area. Unknown purpose. Proceed with caution. Rodriguez felt a chill run down her spine. Military vehicles here, today? That seemed like a strange coincidence. She looked back down at Jake, studying his patches more carefully. Now that she was really looking, some of them did look military. The numbers, the eagle symbols, the style of lettering. How had she missed that before? Martinez, she called over to her colleague. Come here for a minute. Martinez jogged over, wiping sweat from his forehead. The afternoon sun was getting hot and his bulletproof vest wasn't helping. What do you make of these patches? Rodriguez asked, pointing to Jake's jacket. Martinez looked them over again. Now that he wasn't pumped up on adrenaline from the initial stop, he could see them more clearly, too. There were definitely military-style markings there. Could be stolen, Martinez said defensively. Gang members sometimes wear military gear to look tough. But Rodriguez wasn't convinced. She had a brother in the army, and these patches looked authentic. They had the right kind of wear patterns, the right stitching, the right fading that came from actual use rather than being bought at a surplus store. Sir, she said to Jake, I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you active military? Jake looked up at her. He could hear the engines getting closer now. His backup would be here any minute, and then this whole situation would get a lot more complicated. I can't discuss my current employment status, he said carefully, but I can tell you that this situation is about to get much bigger than a simple traffic stop. Rodriguez felt her heart rate spike. That wasn't the answer she was hoping for. What do you mean by that? She demanded. Before Jake could respond, Officer Chun, who had been directing traffic, came running over to Rodriguez. Sergeant, we've got a problem. There are 3 military vehicles heading this way, and they look serious. Full tactical gear, multiple personnel, ADA about 30 seconds. Rodriguez looked around at the scene. She had 3 men in custody, a crowd of civilians with cameras, news crews setting up equipment, and now military vehicles coming to her location. This was spiraling out of control fast. Get on the radio, she told Chun. Contact dispatch and find out if there are any military exercises or operations scheduled for today, and see if anyone knows why they would be coming here. Chun ran back to his patrol car to make the calls, but Rodriguez suspected it was too. Late for that kind of information to be useful, she knelt down next to Jake again. Listen to me very carefully. If you know something about what's happening here, you need to tell me right now. I've got civilian safety to think about. Jake could hear the concern in her voice, and he realized she was trying to do the right thing. She was a good cop who had been put in a bad situation by her colleague's poor judgment. Sergeant Rodriguez, he said, reading her name tag, nobody is in any danger. The people coming are here to help sort this out. But you need to know that this traffic stop may have interfered with something much more important than you realize. What kind of something? The kind of something that requires people with security clearances and special equipment to fix. Rodriguez felt like she was in over her head. She had signed up to be a local police officer, not to deal with military operations and classified information. The sound of heavy vehicles was now very close. She could see concerned looks on the faces of her fellow officers as they realized they might be dealing with something beyond their training and experience. Martinez, she called out, get over here. We need to figure out what we've stepped into. Martinez came over, looking nervous for the first time since the traffic stop began. Sarge, what if we made a mistake? What if these guys really are military? Then we're about to find out, Rodriguez replied grimly. Jake closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The 7-minute countdown was almost over. In just a few more seconds, Colonel Webb and her team would arrive, and everyone would finally understand what had really happened here. He just hoped that when the dust settled, nobody would get hurt, and the important mission scheduled for later that evening could still proceed as planned. The rumbling of engines stopped just around the corner. Jake could hear doors slamming and boots hitting pavement. Webb had arrived, and she was probably not happy about what she was going to find. Rodriguez stood up and straightened her uniform. Whatever was about to happen, she was going to handle it professionally and try to keep everyone safe. The countdown had reached 0. Everything was about to change. The first thing everyone noticed was the sound. 3 massive military vehicles rounded the corner onto Main Street with the deep rumble that only heavy-duty engines can make. The lead vehicle was a black armored truck that looked like it could drive through a brick wall without slowing down. Behind it came 2 more identical vehicles, moving in perfect formation. The crowd on the sidewalk went completely silent. People stopped taking pictures with their phones and just stared. Even the news crews seemed shocked by what they were seeing. This wasn't something that happened in downtown Riverside on a Tuesday afternoon. Sergeant Rodriguez felt her mouth go dry. She had dealt with a lot of unusual situations during her police career, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. Military vehicles didn't just show up at traffic stops. Something was very, very wrong. The convoy pulled up directly behind the police cars, blocking off most of the street. The engines shut off simultaneously, and for a few seconds, everything was eerily quiet. Then the doors opened. Colonel Webb stepped out of the lead vehicle first. She was a tall woman in her 40s, wearing full military fatigues and moving with the kind of confidence that comes from years of command experience. Behind her, 6 more soldiers emerged from the other vehicles, all carrying themselves like they knew exactly what they were doing. Rodriguez had seen military personnel before, but never like this. These weren't soldiers on leave visiting the city. This was a tactical response team, and they were here on business. Webb walked directly toward Rodriguez, her boots clicking on the asphalt. The police officers instinctively moved aside as she approached. There was something about her presence that commanded immediate respect. "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Webb, United States Army," she said, showing her identification. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge of this scene." Rodriguez stepped forward, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "That would be me, Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, Riverside Police Department." "Colonel, can you tell me what this is about?" Webb looked around the scene, taking in the handcuffed men on the ground, the crowd of civilians, the news cameras, and the obvious confusion on the faces of the police officers. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you currently have 3 of my personnel in custody. I need them released immediately." Rodriguez felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. "Your personnel?" "Ma'am, these men were stopped for erratic driving and resisting arrest. We have them on charges of—" "Sergeant," Webb interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind, "let me be very clear. The men you have in custody are active-duty military personnel conducting authorized operations in this area. They were not committing any crimes, and they need to be released right now." Officer Martinez, who had been standing nearby listening to the conversation, stepped forward. "Colonel, with all due respect, I observed dangerous driving behavior. These men were operating their vehicles in an unsafe manner." Webb turned her attention to Martinez, and he immediately felt the weight of her gaze. She had dealt with difficult situations and difficult people throughout her military career, and she knew how to handle both. "Officer, what you observed was standard surveillance detection procedures. These men were conducting a security sweep of this area as part of a classified operation. What you interpreted as erratic driving was actually professional security work." Martinez felt his confidence starting to crack. But they were wobbling on their motorcycles, riding in formation like some kind of gang. "They were maintaining proper spacing for security observation," Webb explained patiently. "And the wobbling you saw was one of my men, adjusting his equipment while maintaining visual contact with potential threat areas." Rodriguez was trying to process all of this information. "Colonel, if these men are military personnel, why didn't they identify themselves when they were stopped?" Webb looked over at Jake, who was still lying on the ground in handcuffs. She could see the scrapes on his face and the awkward way he was positioned. Her jaw tightened slightly. "Because, Sergeant, their operation required them to maintain cover. They couldn't reveal their true purpose without compromising a time-sensitive mission." She walked over to where Jake was lying and knelt down beside him. "Thompson, are you injured?" Jake looked up at his commanding officer with relief. "No, ma'am. Nothing serious. Just some scrapes from the pavement and sore muscles from the electrical shock." Webb's expression darkened. Electrical shock? Rodriguez felt her stomach drop. This was getting worse by the minute. Colonel, the suspects. I mean your personnel. They were tased during the arrest when they appeared to be non-compliant. Webb stood up slowly, her face showing the kind of controlled anger that is much more frightening than shouting. Sergeant Rodriguez, you tased my men? For what reason? We thought they were resisting arrest, Rodriguez said, knowing how weak it sounded. Martinez jumped in to defend their actions. Colonel, they were acting suspicious, wearing gang colors, refusing to cooperate, ... Gang colors? Webb's voice was dangerously quiet. Officer, those are unit identification patches. Military insignia indicating special operations training and security clearance levels. She gestured to one of her soldiers, who immediately moved to Jake's side and began carefully removing his handcuffs. Another soldier did the same for Jake's teammates. Furthermore, Webb continued, my personnel were fully complying with your orders. They were tased while following police instructions to remain still and keep their hands visible. The crowd of civilians was watching all of this with fascination. Some people were still recording, and Rodriguez realized that this entire confrontation was probably going to end up on social media within the hour. Webb helped Jake to his feet as the handcuffs came off. He rubbed his wrists where the metal had been cutting into his skin and rolled his shoulders to work out the stiffness. Thompson, what's the status of the evening operation? Webb asked quietly. Jake looked at his watch. Ma'am, we were supposed to complete the route inspection by 1600 hours. The delay has put us behind schedule, and we haven't finished checking the final 3 checkpoints. Webb's face grew even more serious. That means the convoy route hasn't been properly secured for tonight's transport. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that this situation was much bigger than she had realized. Colonel, what kind of transport operation are we talking about here? Webb looked at her carefully, obviously deciding how much information she could share. Sergeant, let me put it this way. The operation my men were preparing for tonight involves moving classified materials through your city. Materials that are vital to national security. The route they were checking needs to be completely secure before we can proceed. And now it's not secure because we arrested them? Rodriguez asked, dreading the answer. That's correct. The entire operation may have to be postponed or rerouted, which will cost significant time and resources. More importantly, it may compromise other related operations that are depending on this transport being completed on schedule. Martinez was starting to realize the magnitude of what had happened. But Colonel, how are we supposed to know? They look like ... Officer, Webb cut him off. This is exactly why proper identification and communication protocols exist between military and civilian law enforcement. Did anyone think to run their license plates through federal databases? Did anyone check for military identification before making arrests? Rodriguez felt sick. The answer was no, they hadn't done any of those things. They had made assumptions based on appearances and acted without gathering proper information. Webb turned back to Jake and his teammates, who were now standing and checking themselves for injuries. Are you men able to continue the mission? Jake nodded. Yes, ma'am. We can complete the route inspection, but we'll need another 2 hours minimum. Webb checked her own watch and frowned. That pushes us right up against the deadline for tonight's operation. She turned back to Rodriguez. Sergeant, I'm going to need your department's full cooperation to make sure this gets resolved properly. Can I count on that? Rodriguez nodded quickly. Absolutely, Colonel. Whatever you need. But as Webb began coordinating with her team too, salvage the mission timeline. Rodriguez couldn't help but wonder what other consequences might be coming from this massive misunderstanding. The next 2 hours moved like a carefully choreographed dance between chaos and order. Colonel Webb had immediately taken control of the situation, but she also understood that this wasn't just a military operation anymore. It had become a very public incident that would need to be handled with extreme care. The first thing Webb did was establish a secure perimeter around the scene. Her soldiers worked with the police officers to move the crowd back to a safe distance while still allowing the news crews to document what was happening. She knew that trying to hide everything would only make the situation worse. Jake and his teammates were checked over by military medics who had arrived with the convoy. The medics confirmed what Jake already knew. He had some scrapes and bruises from being forced to the ground, and his muscles were still sore from the electrical shock. But nothing serious or permanent. As the medics worked, Webb pulled Sergeant Rodriguez aside for a private conversation. They walked a few steps away from the crowd where they could talk without being overheard. "Sergeant, I want you to understand something," Webb said, her voice much calmer than it had been earlier. "I'm not angry with you personally. You were trying to do your job, and you responded to what your officer reported as suspicious behavior." Rodriguez felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you, Colonel. But I have to ask, how bad is this situation really?" Webb looked back toward the scene, where Jake was now standing and talking with his teammates. "The immediate operational impact is significant. The convoy that was supposed to move through your city tonight was carrying specialized equipment for an overseas deployment. That equipment is now sitting in a secure facility waiting for transport. Can't you just delay it by a day or two?" "It's not that simple," Webb explained. "The receiving unit overseas is depending on this equipment for an operation that's already in progress. Every day of delay means our people are operating without resources they need. Plus, we now have to coordinate with multiple agencies to establish a new secure route." Rodriguez felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "What can we do to help fix this?" Webb smiled slightly, the first time Rodriguez had seen any warmth from the military officer. "Actually, your department can help quite a bit. We're going to need local police support for the new route, and we'll need it fast." Over the next hour, Webb and Rodriguez worked together to coordinate a solution. Jake and his teammates completed their security sweep of the original route, finding no problems other than the time they had lost. Meanwhile, Webb's team established communication with police headquarters to set up protocols for the evening transport. But the real story was what happened with the crowd and the media coverage. The news crews had captured everything from the initial arrest to the arrival of the military convoy. Within an hour, the footage was being broadcast on local television and uploaded to social media. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. Jake found himself in the strange position of being the center of a news story he couldn't really comment on. Reporters kept trying to interview him, but military regulations prevented him from discussing the details of his mission or his unit. "I can only say that this was a misunderstanding that has been resolved," he told one persistent reporter. "The local police were doing their job, and now we're all working together to move forward." Officer Martinez was having a much harder time with the media attention. He kept insisting that he had done nothing wrong, that the traffic stop had been justified based on what he observed. But the more details that came out about who Jake and his teammates really were, the worse Martinez looked. The turning point came when someone in the crowd recognized one of the patches on Jake's jacket. It turned out to be a commendation for service in Afghanistan, something that was a matter of public record. Within minutes, social media was buzzing with information about Jake's military background and his record of distinguished service. Martinez found himself facing a crowd that had turned decidedly hostile. People were shouting questions about why he had tased a military veteran who was serving his country. The situation was getting ugly fast. Webb noticed what was happening and made a decision that surprised everyone. She walked over to where Martinez was standing, clearly overwhelmed by the attention and criticism. "Officer Martinez," she said loudly, "enough for the crowd to hear. I want to make something clear. You responded to what you believed was suspicious behavior. That's your job. The problem here wasn't your decision to make a traffic stop. The problem was a lack of communication between our agencies." She turned to address the crowd directly. "This officer was trying to keep your community safe. He didn't have information. That would have told him who these men really were. That's not his fault. That's a system problem that we need to fix." The crowd quieted down, and Martinez looked at Webb with gratitude and surprise. She had just defended him when she could have easily thrown him under the bus. However, Webb continued, still addressing the crowd, "This incident has shown us that we need better coordination between military operations and local law enforcement. We can't have situations like this happening again." Over the next several days, the story continued to develop. The military transport operation was successfully completed using the new route that Webb and Rodriguez had coordinated. The specialized equipment reached its destination on time, and the overseas mission proceeded as planned, but the real changes came in the weeks and months that followed. The incident sparked a complete review of how military operations coordinated with local police departments. New protocols were established to ensure that law enforcement agencies had better information about military personnel operating in their areas. Jake and his teammates received counseling and medical follow-up to make sure there were no lasting effects from the incident. The military also conducted its own investigation to determine if there were ways the situation could have been prevented. For Officer Martinez, the aftermath was more complicated. While Colonel Webb had defended him publicly, the police department conducted its own internal review. They concluded that Martinez had acted within department policy, but they also implemented new training on how to handle situations involving military personnel. Sergeant Rodriguez found herself at the center of efforts to improve communication between agencies. She worked with military liaisons to develop new procedures and became something of an expert on military-civilian coordination. The most significant change came in the emergency response protocols. The 7-minute automatic response system that had brought Webb's team to the scene was refined and expanded. New safeguards were put in place to prevent false alarms, but the basic concept proved so effective that other military units began adopting similar systems. Jake returned to his regular duties, but the incident had a lasting impact on him as, well, he became an advocate for better training and communication between military and civilian agencies. He often spoke at police training sessions, helping officers understand how to recognize legitimate military operations. The patch on his jacket that had caused so much confusion became something of a teaching tool. Jake would show it to police officers and explain what the symbols meant, helping them understand how to identify authentic military insignia versus fake patches that might be worn by people pretending to be in the service. Years later, when people talked about the incident on Main Street, they often focused on how a simple misunderstanding had spiraled into a major confrontation. But those who were there remembered something else, how quickly people on both sides had worked together to find solutions once they understood what had really happened. The 7-minute response time became a new standard for military emergency protocols, proving that sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unexpected situations.